He didn't ask if she was ready. That was the thing Naomi Whitaker would remember long after the bruises faded. The way Harold Greer had simply decided, the way a man decides to move furniture or slaughter a hog, that she had no more say in her own life than either of those things did. He'd pressed his thumb against her cheekbone that final morning, the way you'd test a piece of fruit at market, and said, "You smile when you get off that stage. You smile, and you act grateful, and you remember what I did for you." Then he'd look down at Lily, 6 years old, her left arm already wrapped in a splint that smelled of old wood and unwashed bandage, and he'd added, "Both of you." Lily hadn't cried. That was the part that broke Naomi in places she still hadn't found words for. 6 years old, and that child hadn't cried because she'd already learned that crying only ever made things worse. If you've ever stood at the edge of something you couldn't undo, a decision made for you, a door locked from the outside, a life that stopped belonging to you before you were old enough to know what belonging meant, then you already understand what Naomi felt when that stagecoach finally pulled away from Harold Greer's property, and she sat rigid on the bench with Lily pressed against her side, watching the only life she'd ever known get swallowed by distance and dust. She didn't know whether what was waiting for her in the Arizona territory would be better. She only knew it couldn't be worse. She was wrong about that, in ways she hadn't anticipated, and right about it too, in ways she hadn't yet imagined were possible. If this story reaches you wherever you are watching, whether that's across the country or across the world, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me until the very end, because what happens next in Naomi's story is something none of us saw coming. The stagecoach rolled into the town of Cutter's Bend, Arizona territory on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1883, and it arrived 20 minutes late because one of the wheels had thrown a pin somewhere back in the canyon, and the driver had spent the better part of an hour kneeling in the road with a spare bolt and language that Naomi had quietly covered Lily's ears against. She stepped down from that coach stiff-legged and squinting in the high desert sun, her left hand holding Lily's good hand and her right gripping the single bag that contained everything she owned in the world. She'd worn her best dress for this. It was the color of old cream, with small buttons up the front, and there was a mend near the collar she'd tried to hide with the angle of her jaw. She'd pinned her hair back. She'd done everything a woman was supposed to do when she was about to meet the man she was going to marry. She hadn't been able to do anything about her face. The bruise along her left cheekbone had gone that particular color that bruises go when they're 3 or 4 days old, greenish yellow at the edges, still deep purple at the center, and no amount of powder she'd managed to beg from the other woman on the coach had made it look like anything other than what it was. There was a small cut at the corner of her mouth that had healed into a thin, dark line. And if you knew where to look, if you were the kind of person who paid attention to the way a body moves when it's learned to brace for impact, you'd have seen the careful way Naomi held herself, the slight flinch when the stagecoach door swung too hard on its hinge, the way her shoulders never fully came down from around her ears. Lily stood beside her in a faded blue dress that had been washed so many times the color had gone soft, her small shoes kicking up little clouds of red Arizona dust. She held herself the same way her mother did, watchful, contained, waiting for the shape of the threat to become clear before committing to any emotion. A 6-year-old shouldn't know how to do that. But Lily knew. She'd been learning it since before she could properly walk. The splint on her left arm was a rough thing, 2 flat pieces of pine board, wrapped in strips torn from an old feed sack, tied with cord. The town doctor back in New Mexico had set it as best he could in the 15 minutes Naomi had been able to manage before Harold noticed she'd left the property. The bone was broken clean through, about 2 inches above the wrist. The doctor had said it would heal straight if she kept it still. He'd said it in the tone of voice men use when they want to say something else entirely, but have decided it isn't their business. The town of Cutter's Bend materialized around them as Naomi stood and let her eyes adjust. A single main street of hard-packed earth, a general store, a livery, a building with sheriff painted on a board above the door, a saloon that was already making noise despite the afternoon hour, a church with a weather vane listing at a worrying angle. People moved along the boardwalks. A woman with a market basket stopped and looked at Naomi with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who didn't think she was being obvious about it. 2 men leaning against a post in front of the livery tracked her with their eyes from the moment she stepped off the coach, until she looked directly at them, at which point they both found other things to study. She heard the whispers before she actually distinguished any words. That particular register of sound, the lowered voice, the significant pause, the response that was half breath and half syllable, she'd been hearing it her entire life. First in the orphanage, then in Harold's house. Now here, apparently. New territory, same music. Naomi set her jaw and looked down the street for the man whose photograph she'd been carrying in her coat pocket for 6 weeks. Gideon Cross was not difficult to find. He was standing 20 feet away from the stagecoach, slightly apart from the small cluster of people who'd gathered to watch the coach arrive. And he was already looking at her with an expression she had absolutely no framework for reading. He was taller than the photograph had suggested, broad through the shoulders, wearing a plain dark coat over a work shirt that told you this was a man who spent his days doing actual labor and had dressed up for this occasion and wasn't entirely comfortable with the result. He had a hat in his hands. He'd taken it off and was turning it slowly by the brim in a way that might have been nerves or might have been habit. His hair was dark, shot through at the temples with the first threads of gray. He was somewhere on the far side of 40. He was looking at her face, not the way Harold looked at her face after he'd done something to it, checking for the evidence of his own power, cataloging what he'd accomplished. Gideon Cross was looking at her face the way a man looks at something that has cost him a certainty he'd been holding on to. His expression shifted through several things in the space of about 4 seconds, and Naomi, who had become very skilled at reading the emotional weather of men, watched all of it and still couldn't quite name what settled at the end. Then he looked down. He saw Lily. And whatever Naomi hadn't been able to read in his expression a moment ago resolved into something entirely clear. He crouched down. Not quickly, not with the exaggerated enthusiasm of a man performing kindness for an audience. He just lowered himself until he was at Lily's eye level, resting one forearm across his knee, and he looked at the little girl with the faded blue dress and the splinted arm and the face that knew better than to show what it was thinking. "What's your name?" he asked. Lily said nothing. Her fingers tightened on Naomi's hand. "That's fair," Gideon said. "You don't know me. No reason to tell a stranger your name." He paused. "Mine's Gideon, in case you decide you want to know." He stood back up. He looked at Naomi. Not at her face this time, at her eyes, holding the look just long enough to say, "I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw, but I'm also not going to make you stand here in the street and explain it." "Your bag?" he said. Naomi handed it over before she'd consciously decided to. She noted that afterward, with the small, cold part of her mind that kept a running inventory of her own instincts. "You just handed a man you don't know the only thing you own. Pay attention to why." She paid attention. She didn't have an answer yet, but she paid attention. The wagon ride to the Cross Ranch took the better part of an hour, out along a road that wound through scrub and red rock and low hills, covered in the dry silver green of desert brush. The sky was enormous out here in a way that took adjustment. Naomi had spent most of her life in places with walls and ceilings and horizons that stopped before they got too big, and this sky went on in a way that felt almost aggressive in its vastness. Gideon drove the wagon. Naomi sat beside him. Lily sat between them, her feet not quite reaching the footboard, her splinted arm held carefully in her lap. Nobody spoke for the first several miles. This too, Naomi noted. Most men couldn't bear silence. Harold had never been able to tolerate it. Silence meant he didn't have control of the room, and Harold always had to have control of the room. The men at the orphanage had been the same way, in their different fashions. Even the men she'd encountered more briefly, at markets, at the agency office back in Santa Fe where she'd signed the papers to become a mail-order bride. Even they had filled every available space with sound, with questions, with the small performances of authority that men seemed to need the way fish needed water. Gideon Cross drove his wagon and let the silence be. After a while, Lily said, without preamble or apparent reason, "A mockingbird." Both adults looked at her. She pointed with her good arm, off to the left, into a scrubby mesquite bush at the edge of the road. "That's a mockingbird. It's making 3 different calls. Mama taught me." Gideon looked toward the bush. You could hear it now that she'd named it, a fluid, shifting sequence of sounds, one bleeding into another. "She's right," he said. "That's a mockingbird. Good ear." He paused. "You like birds?" Lily considered this with the gravity of a person settling a philosophical question. Some of them, she finally said. Gideon nodded as though this were a perfectly reasonable position. That's about how I feel about people, he said. Something crossed Lily's face, something small and bright that came and went before it could properly establish itself. It might have been the beginning of amusement. Naomi filed it away. The ranch was larger than Naomi had expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected. The letters Gideon had written to the agency had mentioned a prosperous operation, cattle, a proper house, 2 hired men who lived in a bunkhouse 50 yards from the main structure. She'd imagined something adequate, something sufficient. The main house was built from adobe brick and rough timber, 2 stories, with a wide covered porch that ran the full length of the front and a vegetable garden along the south side that someone was clearly tending with genuine care. The garden was what surprised her most. There were neat rows of late-season plants, some already gone to seed, staked and tied with strips of cloth. Someone had put effort into that garden that went beyond usefulness. Someone had wanted it to look like something worth looking at. A man came out of the barn as they pulled up, mid-50s, weathered to the color and texture of good saddle leather, with a gray mustache and the deliberate movements of someone whose joints had strong opinions about cold mornings. That's Hector, Gideon said. He's been with the ranch since before I bought it. Knows where everything is and how it works, including me. Hector reached them as Gideon climbed down and came around to help Naomi from the wagon. He looked at Naomi's face with the same immediate recognition she'd been getting all day, and then he looked at Lily, and then he looked at Gideon with an expression that contained an entire conversation in it. Miss Whitaker, he said with a formality that somehow managed to be warm rather than stiff. Welcome. He looked at Lily. And who's this? Lily, said Lily, before Naomi could speak. Lily, Hector repeated, as though testing the sound of it. Good name, strong name. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a piece of hard candy wrapped in a twist of paper. I generally don't carry these, he said, offering it with an entirely straight face. But I had a feeling about today. Lily looked at the candy, looked at her mother. Naomi gave the smallest nod. Lily took the candy. She didn't unwrap it immediately. She held it in her good hand and looked at it, and Naomi understood exactly what was happening because she'd have done the same thing herself. Her daughter was deciding whether this was something that could be trusted. Gideon showed Naomi the room he'd prepared for her. It was on the 2nd floor, facing east, with a window that looked out over the vegetable garden and the long, flat distance beyond. The room had a bed with an iron frame, a dresser with a wash basin on top, a small table and chair, a braided rug in muted reds and browns. It was clean, scrupulously clean, the kind of clean that took time and intention. On the dresser, someone had put a small vase with dried wildflowers in it. Naomi stood in the doorway looking at those wildflowers for a moment longer than was probably noticeable. There's another room at the end of the hall, Gideon said. For Lily. He paused. Or she can stay in here with you if she'd be more comfortable. He didn't add anything to that. He didn't explain why a 6-year-old might need the option of staying with her mother in an unfamiliar house. He just left the option open and stood back from it. We'll start here, Naomi said, both of us. And see? She looked at him directly. I need you to understand something before any of this goes further. All right. I'm not going to pretend that anything you see is something other than what it is. I won't make up a story about what happened to my face. I won't make up a story about Lily's arm, but I also... She stopped. This next part was harder to say than she'd expected. I am not someone who needs to be rescued. I need... She had to search for the word. I need conditions. I need to know what the conditions here are. Gideon looked at her steadily. He wasn't rushing her. He wasn't filling the air with reassurances. He was just waiting, in that particular way she'd observed, and it was somehow more respectful than anything anyone had said to her in years. The conditions here, he said finally, are that this is your home if you want it to be. That's the first condition. The second is that nothing in this house gets decided by force. Not ever. If you want something different from what you've got, you say it, and we talk about it. That's it. There aren't more conditions than that. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. People say things, she said. I know they do. You've said them yourself, probably, to somebody. Something moved through his expression, acknowledgement, and something else beneath it that she recognized dimly as pain or its aftermath. Probably, he agreed. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I've never been wrong. What I'm telling you is what the conditions are in this house. Naomi looked out the window at the vegetable garden. The dying afternoon light was doing something particular to the color of the soil. We'll try, she said. They didn't try to have the conversation about the marriage that first evening. There was too much else happening. Hector's wife, Esperanza, appeared from somewhere in the back of the house and immediately took charge of the kitchen in a way that allowed no argument and produced a supper of beans and salt pork and cornbread that was simple and exactly right. Lily sat at the table and ate 2 full portions, which told Naomi more about the last several weeks of their lives than she would ever say out loud. Afterward, Esperanza produced a small cloth doll from some hidden resource of her own, worn but carefully kept, its embroidered face still distinct, and handed it to Lily without comment. Lily held the doll against her chest with her good arm and looked at Esperanza. My granddaughter left it, Esperanza said. She's too old for it now. She'd want it to go to someone who needed it. This was, as far as Naomi could tell, probably untrue. But it was the right thing to say, and Lily accepted it as such. And that evening, Naomi put her daughter to bed in the room they were sharing. The doll tucked against Lily's uninjured side, the splinted arm laid carefully on top of the quilt, and sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time after the child fell asleep. She was waiting for the feeling she always felt in a new place, the calculating assessment of exits, the cataloging of distances, the mental mapping of which direction was away. She was waiting for her own fear to tell her what to do. The fear was there. It was always there. But it wasn't telling her to run. She didn't know what to do with that. The next morning brought the first real conversation. Naomi was already up when Gideon came in from his pre-dawn rounds. She'd woken at 4:30 out of old habit, that particular hour when Harold's mood was most unpredictable and therefore required monitoring, and she'd been unable to go back to sleep. She'd found the kitchen by feel, gotten the stove going, and by the time the sun was a thin line of orange at the eastern edge of the world, she had coffee made and was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup and her eyes on the window. Gideon came in through the back door, pulling off his work gloves, and stopped when he saw her. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. He got a cup. He sat across from her at the table, not beside her, across, where she could see him, where there was space between them. She noted that too. I need to tell you something, he said, before you hear it from someone in town. All right. People are going to talk about the fact that you came with a child who isn't mine, about, he paused, choosing his words with visible care, about your face, about what they think it means about where you came from and what kind of woman you are. He looked at her directly. I want you to know that none of that changes anything I've offered. Naomi wrapped both hands more firmly around her cup. What exactly are they going to say? They're going to say a man looking for a wife shouldn't take on another man's child. They're going to say a woman who shows up looking the way you look has got trouble following her and that trouble's going to land here. He paused. Mrs. Halloran at the general store is going to say it loudest. And what do you say? Gideon looked at his coffee cup. I say Mrs. Halloran has never had a day in her life harder than a broken fingernail, and that gives her a certain amount of time to concern herself with other people's business. Despite everything, despite the coffee and the early hour, and the 3 days of road dust still worked into the weave of her skirt, and the bruise on her face, and the general accumulated weight of the last several years of her life, Naomi laughed. It was a short sound, more surprised than amused, but it was real. She felt it in her chest. Gideon looked up from his coffee. He wasn't smiling exactly, but something in his face had shifted towards something lighter. You were going to ask what the plan is, he said, about the marriage, about the arrangement. I was. The plan is there's no plan. He set his cup down. What I mean by that is, I'm not going to hold you to something because of a piece of paper or because money changed hands. I paid for your passage. That doesn't make you bought. That's not... He stopped, started again. I want you to stay. I think this place could be good for you and for your daughter, but I don't want it to be something you're trapped in. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Why did you send for a bride in the first place? The question seemed to land differently than she'd intended it, or maybe exactly as she'd intended it, because she'd meant it honestly. Gideon was quiet for a moment in the way of someone taking the question seriously, rather than reaching for the easy answer. This ranch runs. It runs well. I've got land and cattle and good men, and I know what I'm doing here. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. But you come in from the range at the end of the day, and there's nobody to tell anything to. You've done something difficult, or something went right, or you found a hawk's nest in the high pasture, and you want to say it to somebody who'll... He stopped. That sounds small. No, Naomi said, it doesn't. He looked at her. I had someone to tell things to, she said carefully. That's not what made it survivable. What would have made it survivable is if the person I was telling things to was... She stopped too. Someone who actually wanted to hear them. They sat with that for a moment, both of them looking at their coffee cups, not at each other. Give it time, he finally said. Don't decide anything yet, just give it time. Lily met the horses 3 days after their arrival. Gideon had been careful about it. He hadn't proposed it, hadn't suggested it, hadn't organized it as an event. He'd simply been going to the barn one morning when Lily appeared at his elbow, the way small children sometimes appear, without warning or apparent motive, and said, I want to see. See what? He asked. She pointed at the barn. Gideon looked down at her. Lily looked back up at him with the patient, unblinking assessment of a child who has learned to read people very quickly and very accurately. She was measuring him, Naomi realized from the porch where she was watching, measuring what kind of person he was going to turn out to be in a context her mother wasn't managing. Come on then, Gideon said. He did not take her hand. He just walked toward the barn at a pace she could match, and she walked beside him, and when he got to the barn doors and opened the near one, he stepped back and let her look through before he went in himself. There were 4 horses in the stalls. Gideon's working horse, a big dun gelding named Porter, occupied the nearest stall and turned his heavy head toward the door with the mild curiosity of an animal that has seen everything. Lily stood in the doorway and looked at Porter. Porter looked at Lily. Does he bite? Lily asked. He's bitten me twice, Gideon said honestly. Once because I startled him, and once because I deserved it. Lily seemed to find this a satisfactory answer. She took 2 steps into the barn. Porter watched her with his enormous, calm eyes. Can I touch him? Come around to this side, Gideon said, moving to Porter's left. Come up at his shoulder. Don't come in from the front. He can't see you well from the front, and it worries him. Lily listened carefully and followed the instructions precisely. She came up at Porter's shoulders and raised her good arm and laid her small hand flat against the horse's neck. Porter exhaled, a long, warm, hay-scented breath that moved Lily's hair. Lily stood very still. Something in her face changed, that tight, watchful, calculated look loosening just slightly at the edges, like a fist beginning to open. Naomi pressed her knuckles against her mouth and stayed where she was on the porch and did not go down to the barn. 2 weeks in, the trouble arrived from town. It came in the form of a man named Burl Whitfield, who arrived at the ranch on a Friday afternoon in a buggy that was slightly too fine for the dust it was kicking up. He was the kind of man whose clothes were always a gesture at wealth, where the wealth itself might be more implied than actual. A heavy gold watch chain without a watch, boots that had been expensive once and been resold cheaper since. He had the confident bearing of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and being recognized. He was, Hector told Naomi quietly, as they watched the buggy come down the approach road, one of 3 men on the town council. Gideon met him in the yard. Naomi stayed on the porch with Lily, near enough to hear. Gideon, Whitfield said, stepping down from the buggy with the easy familiarity of a man who believes himself among his own kind. He didn't look at Naomi directly, but his awareness of her was visible in the slight pause before he continued. Heard your, bride arrived. She did, Gideon said. He was standing with his thumbs hooked in his belt, relaxed and squared up at once in the way of a man who knows exactly where all his weight is. Heard there were some particulars to the situation. Whitfield's eyes drifted toward the porch, toward Naomi, and then down toward Lily. A child. Lily, Gideon said. Whitfield turned his attention back to Gideon with a smile that had calculation running beneath it like a current under ice. I'll speak plainly, because you've always appreciated that. There are folks in town, good folks, solid citizens, who have concerns about the propriety of the situation. A man in your position, taking on a woman with history. What kind of history? Gideon asked. The question was mild, but something in his voice had changed quality in a way that Burl Whitfield, who was perhaps not as good at reading people as he believed, missed entirely. Well, Whitfield said, the way she looks. And the child that isn't yours. People talk, Gideon. It reflects on the whole community when a man of standing makes certain. She was beaten, Gideon said. Whitfield stopped. That's why she looks the way she looks, Gideon continued, in exactly the same tone. She was beaten by the man who was supposed to be responsible for her care, and her daughter has a broken arm for the same reason. And they're both here now, and this is where they're going to stay, and I'm not entirely sure what you thought you were going to accomplish by coming out here, Burl, but if it was changing any of those facts, you've had a wasted trip. Whitfield looked at him for a moment. Something flickered in his expression, reassessment, and beneath it, the faint irritation of a man who has walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and found another. The preacher's going to have thoughts, he said finally, about whether it's proper to perform a ceremony for a... There's a preacher 3 counties over, Gideon said, who I've known for 20 years and who doesn't concern himself with other people's thoughts. When Naomi and I are ready, we'll go see him. He paused. Anything else? There wasn't. Whitfield drove his fine-ish buggy back down the approach road without another word, and Gideon stood and watched him go with his thumbs still in his belt. Naomi was looking at the back of Gideon's head. She was thinking about the moment he'd said her name, when she was beaten by the man who was supposed to be responsible for her care, not as a story, not as an explanation, but as a plain fact that did not require management or apology or the flinching around it that she was so used to doing herself. He'd said it the way you state a thing that is simply true. She didn't know what to do with that either, but she was starting to collect these moments the way she'd once collected the small evidence of exits. The window left unlatched, the horse left saddled. She was beginning to understand that she was collecting them for the same reason, to know whether she was safe, to know whether it was real. Lily's arm came out of the splint on a Thursday in November. The doctor in town, a lean, precise man named Alderman, who moved through his own examining room with the careful economy of someone who has done a great deal of work in a small space, removed the boards and unwrapped the bindings, and held the small wrist between his 2 hands for a long moment, feeling along the bone with his thumbs. Straight, he said. She kept it still. He looked at Lily. Did it hurt? When you were healing? Yes, Lily said. Did you tell anyone? A pause. Mama. Dr. Alderman nodded. He moved Lily's wrist gently, testing the range. Can you make a fist? Lily made a careful fist. Open it again. She opened it. He put a pencil flat across her palm. Grip that. She gripped it, not full strength, and he could see that. There was a hesitation, a guarding quality to the movement, but she gripped it. She'll need to use it, he said to Naomi. Carefully at first, gentle work, nothing that stresses the joint, but she needs to move it or it'll stiffen. He looked at Gideon, who had insisted on coming with no explanation that Naomi had heard. The ranch. Is there something she could do? Light work, something with her hands. Gideon said, There's a horse that needs brushing every day. Lily looked up at him. Porter, he said. He's gotten particular about who does it. Hector's arms are too short and mine aren't patient enough. Somebody's got to brush him every morning. Naomi watched her daughter's face. She watched the calculation that was always running in that small, careful face. The checking of whether this is real, whether this is a trick, whether there's a cost concealed somewhere in the offer. She watched Lily run through all of it in about 4 seconds. Then she watched something she hadn't seen in longer than she could precisely measure. She watched her daughter decide to believe something. Okay, Lily said. December brought cold that surprised Naomi. She'd expected Arizona to be warm, based on some vague geography she'd absorbed without examining, and instead found mornings that were hard with frost and evenings that sent everyone to the stove. She learned the ranch's rhythms the way she'd always learned the rhythms of places she'd been, by observation first, by participation second, by a kind of cautious integration that moved slower than the people around her might have liked, but that she couldn't hurry without feeling the ground give way beneath her. Esperanza taught her to make the bean stew that was the ranch's staple cold-weather food, and let her make it wrong twice before correcting anything, which told Naomi a great deal about Esperanza's philosophy of teaching. She learned which fence posts were Hector's and which were Gideon's by the slightly different angles they drove them, and she learned that the dun-horse porter would accept apples but not carrots, and that this distinction was apparently a matter of moral principle as far as Porter was concerned. She learned that Gideon Cross was in the habit of sitting on the porch for an hour in the evening after supper, in all but the worst weather, and that during this hour he didn't particularly require company or conversation, but didn't turn them away either. She started sitting with him sometimes, on the evenings when Lily was asleep and the house was quiet, and she found herself at loose ends with her own thoughts. They talked about small things, mostly, the state of the fence line, the behavior of certain cattle, what Hector had said about the weather coming, practical things, frontier things, the small currency of two people living in the same place and working out how to share the space. Occasionally, they talked about other things. "You were married before," she said one evening. Not a question. Hector had mentioned it, in passing, the way he mentioned things he thought she should know. Gideon was quiet for a moment. 8 years, he said. She waited. She died, he said. Fever. 4 years ago. We didn't have children. He paused. We wanted them. It wasn't something that happened. Naomi looked at the winter dark and the hard, cold stars that were appearing at the horizon. Is that why you sent for a bride? Another pause, more honest than most of his pauses. Partly. He turned the hat. Not there, he never had it in the evenings, just the habit of his hands wanting something to do. Partly because the ranch was getting bigger and I was getting lonelier in equal measure and I couldn't see how to fix that alone. That's honest. I try to be. Harold was honest too, she said, before she'd fully decided to say it. In the beginning, I thought... She stopped. I thought honesty was a sign, that it meant the rest would be what it seemed like. I was wrong. Gideon said nothing. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't tell her he was different. He sat with what she'd said and let it sit there without trying to fix it, and she found, unexpectedly, with a quality of surprise that was almost physical, that this was exactly the right thing. I know, she added more quietly. I know you're not him. I'm not saying you are. You're saying you don't know yet. Yes. That's fair, he said. Take whatever time it takes. January arrived, and with it came a letter. It came on the stage addressed to Naomi Whitaker, in handwriting she recognized before she'd consciously processed what she was seeing, and the recognition moved through her body before it reached her mind. A cold that had nothing to do with the winter air, a tightening across her shoulders, a specific quality of alertness that she hadn't felt in 3 months. Harold Greer had found her address. She stood in the road in front of the general store with the letter in her hand and Mrs. Halloran watching from behind her front window, and she made herself breathe evenly until she could think. The letter was short. 3 sentences. It said he knew where she was. It said the girl was his responsibility and he intended to exercise it. It said she had 2 weeks to respond with her intention to return before he took other steps. She folded it. She put it in her coat pocket. She walked back to the ranch. She told Gideon that evening. She watched him read it. She watched his face go very still in the way it went still when something had landed that he was processing carefully. He read it twice, folded it the way she had, set it on the table between them. He's not her father, Naomi said. He has no legal claim. I know. Gideon looked at the letter. He'll say he was her guardian. He was my guardian, she said. Not hers. Lily's father left before she was born. Harold had no legal relationship to Lily. You'll need to document that. I know. Alderman can write up something about the arm, the nature of the injury. It's evidence of... He stopped. Abuse, she said. The word sat flat and clear between them. She'd been saying it in her own head for years, and this was the first time she'd said it to another person in plain air. Not as an explanation or apology, but as a term for a fact. Gideon looked at her. Yes, he said. It's evidence of abuse. If he comes here, he won't get near either of you. The words were quiet. Not theatrical, not the performative kind of promise that men sometimes made in order to seem powerful. Just a statement of intention delivered with the same directness he used for everything else. Naomi looked at him across the table. She was doing her arithmetic again, the same arithmetic she'd been doing since October. Cataloging, testing, measuring, checking each thing against each other thing. Why? She asked. Why does this matter to you? She's not your daughter. I'm not your wife yet. You could wash your hands of this. You could. I could, he agreed. Then why? He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man searching for the right answer, but the silence of a man deciding whether to say the true one. Because I watched that child put her hand on Porter's neck for the first time, he said, and I saw what it looked like when someone who'd forgotten how to trust anything started to remember. And I'm not going to let a man take that from her. He paused. Or from you. Naomi was quiet for a long time. All right, she said finally. All right, what? She looked at him, straight at him, the way she'd been learning to do in this house. The way she was slowly remembering was something she was allowed to do. All right, she said, let's talk to the lawyer in town. It wasn't everything. It wasn't even most of it. But it was the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach in October that she'd used the word let's to mean herself and someone else, together, moving in the same direction. It was, she thought, a beginning. The lawyer's name was Emmett Crane, and he operated out of a single room above the feed store on Cutter's Bend's Main Street, accessible by an exterior staircase that announced your arrival to anyone within half a block by virtue of the noise every step made going up. Naomi climbed it on a Monday morning in late January with Gideon 2 steps behind her and Harold Greer's letter folded in her coat pocket, and she thought about how many times in her life she'd climbed stairs like this, stairs that led to men who would decide things, and how different it felt to be climbing them with someone behind her who was there because he'd chosen to be. Emmett Crane was somewhere in his 60s, with the soft-spoken precision of a man who had learned long ago that the words that actually mattered in any legal proceeding were the specific ones, not the loud ones. He read Harold's letter twice, as Gideon had, and then set it on his desk and folded his hands on top of it. He uses the word responsibility, Crane said. Not father, not guardian, responsibility. He was appointed my guardian when I was 14, Naomi said, by a county court in New Mexico. I was an orphan. He was a distant relation of my mother's. She paused. The appointment said nothing about any future children I might have. And Lily's father? Left before she was born. No acknowledgement, no support, no contact of any kind in 7 years. She looked at Crane steadily. He has no legal standing. Greer will argue that his guardianship over you extended to your household. My guardianship ended when I turned 21, Naomi said, 3 years ago. Crane looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, something between professional assessment and something more personal, like a man recalibrating. You've thought this through, he said. I've had time, she said. I've had a long time to think about exactly what my legal situation was. What she didn't say, what she didn't need to say, and what Crane's expression acknowledged without requiring her to, was that people in her situation learned the law the way prisoners learn the dimensions of their cell. Not because they expected it to free them, but because knowing the shape of the thing was the only form of control available. Crane spent the next hour making notes. He would write to the county court in New Mexico. He would document Lily's injury through Dr. Alderman. He would draft a response to Greer's letter that was legally precise and left no opening for the kind of argument Greer was presumably preparing to make. He was thorough and unhurried and charged a fee that Gideon paid without discussion while Naomi was putting on her coat, in the particular way of someone who has decided not to make a thing of something. She noticed. She said nothing about it until they were back on the street, in the cold, flat light of the January morning, and then she said, You didn't have to do that. I know. I intend to pay you back. He looked at her, not with the particular expression men used when they were about to explain why that wasn't necessary. The charitable expression, the one that made you feel smaller the more kindly it was meant. He looked at her with the straightforward acknowledgement of someone who had heard what she said and taken it seriously. All right, he said, we'll keep track. She hadn't expected that answer. The unexpectedness of it lodged somewhere in her chest and stayed there for the rest of the morning. They were walking back toward the wagon when Mrs. Halloran came out of the general store with a basket and a companion Naomi didn't recognize. A woman of about 50, well-dressed for Cutter's Bend, with the upright posture of someone who considered herself a standard-bearer. They stopped on the boardwalk as Naomi and Gideon approached, not quite blocking the way, but arranged in the manner of people who intended to be encountered. Gideon, Mrs. Halloran said. She did not say Naomi's name because she had not yet accorded Naomi the recognition of a name, a fact that was so obvious it didn't need emphasis. This is Margaret Ives, from the Ives family over on the Valley Road. Her husband is on the school board. Mrs. Ives, Gideon said, with the neutral courtesy of a man who understood exactly what was happening and intended to give it the minimum required engagement. Margaret Ives looked at Naomi with the particular kind of examination that society women had been performing on women like Naomi since before either of them was born. The quick vertical assessment, the small compression of the lips, the recalibration of status. The bruise on Naomi's face had faded significantly over the weeks, but there was still enough of it to read, and Margaret Ives read it. I understand you've brought a child with you, she said to Naomi, in the tone of someone raising a concern. I have, Naomi said. The school here takes children from 6, Mrs. Ives said. The school teacher, Miss Pratt, is very capable. She's very selective about the environment she maintains for the other children. The meaning of this was clear enough that it required no translation. Naomi held the woman's gaze with a steadiness that she had earned through years of practice and had no intention of wasting on someone who didn't merit it. Lily is 6, she said. I'll look forward to speaking with Miss Pratt. Something in Margaret Ives' expression shifted, the faint surprise of someone who had expected a different response. She glanced at Gideon and found nothing helpful there. She said her goodbyes and moved on down the boardwalk, Mrs. Halloran trailing in her wake. The school board, Gideon said, when they were out of earshot. I heard. Ives has 3 votes on it. If he decides, one thing at a time, Naomi said. He looked at her sideways. We deal with Greer first, she said, then the school board, if it comes to that. He nodded once. One thing at a time, he agreed. They drove back to the ranch in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together and are still deciding what it means. The response to Harold Greer's letter went out on a Wednesday, carried on the eastbound stage, and the waiting that followed was its own kind of weather, a pressure front that settled over the ranch and didn't lift. Naomi went about her days with the deliberate ordinariness of someone refusing to be unmade by an absence of information. She learned the vegetable garden, studying Esperanza's method of planning the next season's beds while the ground was still frozen. She sat with Lily in the evenings and taught her letters from a primer Gideon had ordered from the territorial capital, and she noticed that Lily moved her left hand more each day. Small movements, careful ones, the way a person tests the solidity of ice before trusting it with their weight. Porter was being brushed every morning. This was established fact now, a fixed point in the ranch's routine as settled as the feeding schedule or the fence checks. Lily appeared at the barn in the morning with her good arm swinging and her healing arm held at a careful angle, and she went through the ritual of the brush and the curry comb with the methodical attention that Gideon had observed would likely make her a better horsewoman than most adults he knew. Porter had, in the way of horses, apparently decided something about this small person who came every morning without fail and spoke to him in a low, continuous murmur that Gideon could never quite make out from the distance he maintained, deliberately, out of some instinct that this was Lily's thing and Lily's space, and his being too present in it would change its quality. He watched from the fence sometimes, not in a way he thought anyone noticed. Naomi noticed. She noticed most things. It was a survival skill she'd developed so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable from personality. The reading of rooms, of pauses, of the small behavioral tells that people thought they were concealing. She noticed the way Gideon positioned himself at the fence, the particular angle that gave him sight lines to the barn, but left him nominally engaged in something else, checking the fence posts, looking toward the upper pasture, anything that wasn't obviously watching. She noticed the way his posture changed when Lily's voice drifted out of the barn, that barely perceptible settling, like a man who has been carrying something and just shifted the weight to a more sustainable position. She told herself this was useful information. She told herself she was still taking inventory. She was not entirely sure that was all it was anymore. February arrived with the letter, but not the one they'd been expecting. It came from Emmett Crane's contact at the New Mexico County Court, a clerk who had been, Crane wrote in the accompanying note, surprisingly forthcoming. The guardianship record for Naomi Whittaker showed termination at the ward's 21st birthday, as Naomi had stated. There was no subsequent legal proceeding by Harold Greer, no custody claim, No court order of any kind connecting him to Lily. There was also, the clerk had noted informally, a separate matter on record. Two separate matters, in fact. Two women, in the 5 years prior to Naomi's departure, who had made complaints to the county sheriff about Harold Greer. Neither complaint had resulted in prosecution. Both complaints described patterns that were, the clerk had written in the careful language of official correspondence, consistent with Naomi's own situation. Crane brought this to the ranch himself, which told Naomi something about how he read the significance of it. "He's done this before," Gideon said. He was reading the letter at the kitchen table, and his voice had gone to that particular flatness. Not cold, not loud, but with a quality of containment that Naomi was coming to understand meant something was being held very carefully in check. "The complaints were dropped," Crane said. He was sitting across from Gideon with his hat on his knee, both times. The women in question, one left the territory entirely and couldn't be located. The other recanted. Naomi stood at the kitchen counter with her arms folded and thought about what it took for a woman in those circumstances to recant. She thought about it very specifically, from the inside of knowing, and felt the particular cold nausea of recognition. "He'll try to come," she said. "Maybe," Crane said. "Or he may decide the legal exposure isn't worth it and let the matter drop." He paused. "Men like Greer prefer situations where they hold the advantage. A documented record of prior complaints, even uncorroborated ones, changes the calculation." "Will it stop him?" Gideon asked. Crane considered this with the honesty of a man who doesn't deal in reassurances he can't back up. "It complicates him," he said. "That's the best I can offer." After Crane left, Naomi stood on the porch in the February cold and watched his horse pick its way back down the approach road. The sky was the color of pewter. The mountains in the distance were white along their upper edges. She could hear from inside the barn the small industry of Lily's morning routine with Porter. Gideon came and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The cold was the kind that got into the seams of things, and Naomi felt it in her hands, which she hadn't bothered to put gloves on before coming outside. "If he comes here," she said, "I need you to not—" She stopped, reformulated. "If he comes here, I need to be the one who speaks, not you." She felt Gideon turn to look at her. "He spent 20 years watching men manage the situations he created," she said. "He knows how to work men. He knows how to make himself the reasonable party in a conversation with another man. He doesn't know what to do with a woman who speaks for herself." She paused. "He never thought I'd get the chance to." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "You don't agree." "I'm thinking about whether you're right." She looked at him. "I am right." He looked out at the approach road where Crane's horse had disappeared around the bend. "I know you are," he said. "That doesn't make it easy to agree to." "No," she said. "I don't imagine it does." They stood in the cold a moment longer. "He's not coming today," Gideon said. "No." "So come inside." She followed him back into the kitchen, where the stove was working hard, and there was coffee on, and Lily would be in from the barn inside the hour. It was ordinary in the way the mornings had become ordinary, with the specific texture of a life that was accumulating small, familiar things. And Naomi sat down at the table and held her cold hands around a cup of coffee, and let the ordinary settle around her like something she was not yet fully certain she deserved. The school situation resolved itself in a way Naomi hadn't anticipated. She'd prepared for a confrontation with Miss Pratt, the schoolteacher, had gone over in her mind the arguments she'd make, the ground she'd hold, the precise manner in which she'd refuse to be moved by the kind of genteel resistance Margaret Ives had telegraphed. She'd prepared because preparation was what she did, and she'd brought Lily to the schoolhouse on the first Monday in March, with her spine straight and her jaw set. Miss Pratt was approximately 30, with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had recently said something definitive to someone else and was not finished yet. She looked at Lily, actually looked at her, the same way Gideon had looked at her at the stagecoach stop, with real attention, taking in the child who was standing there rather than some version of her she'd already decided on. "Can you read?" she asked Lily directly. Lily, who had been deciphering words from Gideon's primer for 2 months, said, "Some." "Can you count?" "To 100, past it, probably." Miss Pratt nodded. "Sit there," she said, pointing at a desk in the second row. "We're doing arithmetic this morning. We'll see where you are." That was it. No discussion about the arm, now fully healed. No discussion about the circumstances of Lily's arrival. No inquiry that required Naomi to explain anything. Naomi stood at the doorway for a moment, watching Lily settle into the desk with her hands flat on the surface in front of her and her eyes already tracking to the board at the front of the room. She walked back to where Gideon was waiting with the wagon on the street. "Well?" he said. "She started," Naomi said. "Miss Pratt just started." Something in Gideon's expression eased. "She does that," he said. "She was in some trouble when she first came here. The school board wanted someone more accommodating. Ives called her unruly." He thought about it. She told him that her job was to teach children to think, not to think the way he told them to. How is she still here? Because she's the only person within 40 miles who'll do the job for what they're paying. He picked up the reins. And because she's better at it than anyone who might replace her. Naomi climbed up beside him. The morning had broken into something almost warm, the particular tentative warmth of early spring in the territory. And the main street of Cutter's Bend had a busier quality than the winter months. People out on the boardwalks, horses tied at the hitching posts, the general livening of a community that has gotten through another winter and is adjusting to the fact of continuing. "She'll be all right there," Gideon said. "I know," Naomi said. She did know. That was still new enough to notice, the knowing rather than the hoping while expecting the worst. The hardest week came in late March, on no particular occasion and for no single reason. It came on the way things sometimes do, accumulated rather than arrived. A series of small things that each on their own would have been manageable, but together produced a pressure that had nowhere good to go. Gideon lost 2 calves to something wrong with the water source on the far pasture and spent 3 days out riding fence and testing water and coming home after dark with the particular closed-down expression of a man carrying a financial loss he can't afford to show. Lily came home from school on a Thursday crying, which she so rarely did that the sound of it brought Naomi across the house in 3 steps. Because 2 of the older boys had said something about her broken arm, about how it meant her mother was the kind of woman who, and Lily had hit one of them with her slate board, which had ended the conversation but created a different problem. And Naomi, who had been holding herself together with the structural integrity of pure habit for going on 6 months, found herself at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, unable to sleep, and unable to stop thinking about the fact that Harold Greer had not responded to Crane's letter, which meant nothing clear but implied several things, none of them simple. Gideon found her there when he came in from a late check of the water situation. He didn't say anything immediately. He took off his coat. He put the kettle on. He sat down across from her without asking if he could. "Lily's slate board," Naomi said. "I heard about it. Hector rode through town." He paused. "What did they say?" She told him. Gideon sat with that for a moment. Then, "Do you know which boys?" "I know which ones. Miss Pratt suspended them for a day." She shook her head. "But that isn't the part that—" She stopped. He waited. "She hit him," Naomi said, "because she didn't know what else to do with how angry she was. She didn't know how to say it. Her voice did something she'd been disciplining it against for 6 months. "I taught her that. I didn't mean to teach her that, but I did. That when something is wrong and you can't make the words come, you do something physical to make it stop." The kettle was murmuring on the stove. The lamp on the table made a small yellow world of the kitchen. "You got her out," Gideon said quietly, before she learned the rest of it. "I don't know if that's enough. It's a start." "I keep saying that," Naomi said. "Everything is a start. I need something that isn't just a start." He looked at her across the table. He wasn't trying to make her feel better. She could see that. He wasn't arranging his expression toward comfort, wasn't reaching for the reassuring phrases. He was just present, steady, real. "What do you need?" he asked. "Right now, tonight." She thought about it honestly. "I need to not be alone with all of it," she said. "I don't mean I need you to fix it. I don't need that. She looked at her hands. "I've been alone with it for so long, all of it. Every decision and every fear and every calculation about what's coming next. I'm tired of it being only in my head." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tell me what's in your head." So she did. Not all of it. There was a particular order in which things could be said, and she knew that order better than she knew most things. But she told him about the fear that Greer's silence meant he was planning rather than relenting. She told him about the way Lily still flinched sometimes, at random sounds, in ways that had nothing to do with any present danger and everything to do with a past that wasn't finished running through both of them. She told him about the strange dissonance of building something that felt like safety in a place where she hadn't expected to feel it, and not trusting the feeling, and being unable to stop wanting to trust it anyway. He listened to all of it. He made the tea and set a cup in front of her and didn't interrupt. When she stopped, he said, "The dissonance between feeling safe and not trusting that you feel it." "Yes. I think that's—" He paused, choosing carefully. "I think that's what happens when you've had to be your own warning system for long enough. You can't turn it off just because the thing you were warning against is gone. Your system doesn't have a signal for gone." Naomi looked at him. "Doesn't mean you're wrong to be careful," he said. "Means you're still running on old information and the new information hasn't caught up yet." She was quiet for a long moment. "That's surprisingly well put," she said, "for a cattle rancher." Something flickered in his face, not quite a smile, but the shape that came just before one. "I've had time to think about it," he said. "I had my own version of the same problem after Eleanor died. Different situation, but—" He stopped. "The warning system runs even when there's nothing to warn about. You have to teach it what safe looks like, one thing at a time, until it starts to recognize it on its own." "How long did that take?" she asked. "For you?" He considered the honest answer. "I'm not entirely done," he said. She looked at him, and he looked at her. And somewhere in the honest middle of that exchange, something shifted slightly, the way a door shifts when the latch releases. Not open, not yet, but no longer held. "The tea's going cold," she said. "It is," he agreed. They drank it, and it was quiet in the kitchen, and the lamp burned steadily, and outside the Arizona night was doing whatever the Arizona night did when people weren't watching it, and it was enough, for that particular night, to be two people in a warm kitchen with the cold held at bay and nothing decided that couldn't be decided tomorrow. April brought Lily's first full gallop. It was an accident in the sense that Gideon had intended only to lead her around the paddock on Porter at the walk, the way he'd been doing twice a week since early March, with Lily sitting straight in the saddle, in the way she'd apparently decided was the correct way to do it, and Porter moving with the careful, self-important dignity of a horse who knows his passenger is small. But something, a jackrabbit, most likely, coming out of the brush at the paddock fence, caused Porter to skip sideways, and Lily, who was not strapped in and who could have fallen, did not fall. She grabbed the saddle horn with both hands, the left one too, the heeled one, and she stayed on, and then Porter, having determined that the jackrabbit was beneath his notice, moved forward again, and Lily, apparently deciding that if they were moving they might as well move with intention, said something to the horse that neither Naomi nor Gideon heard clearly, and Porter went from a walk to a trot to a full gallop in the space of about 4 seconds. He didn't go far. The paddock fence stopped that particular trajectory. But for the 30 seconds it lasted, Lily was galloping on a horse, her small body forward and her heeled arm firm on the horn and her face turned into the wind, and she was making a sound that it took Naomi a moment to identify because she'd heard it so rarely. She was laughing, openly, unconstrainedly, with the whole of herself. Gideon had gone to the fence in 3 strides. He caught Porter's lead as the horse slowed at the far fence, and he checked the horse first, then looked up at Lily, who was breathing hard and whose hair had come half out of its braid. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," Lily said. She was still breathing fast. Her eyes were very bright. "Can we do it again?" Gideon looked at her for a moment. He looked like a man trying to keep something in his expression that needed keeping in. "Not today," he said. "We work up to it." Lily took this with better grace than Naomi would have expected, which told her that Lily trusted this answer because she trusted the person giving it, had decided that Gideon Cross said what he meant, which was not a conclusion her daughter reached about many people. Naomi, standing at the paddock fence, felt something break very quietly in the center of herself. Not in the bad way. In the way of something that had been held rigid for too long, finally releasing into a shape that was more natural to it. She didn't say anything to Gideon about it that afternoon, but that evening on the porch, in the particular quality of light that April put on the mountains, she said, "She trusts you." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. I don't take it lightly. I know you don't. She looked at the mountains. That's why she does. The conversation about the wedding happened on a Sunday in late April, and it happened because Lily brought it up. She came in from the barn on a Sunday morning and sat down at the breakfast table and said, without particular preamble, "Are you and Mr. Cross going to get married?" Naomi set down the pan she was holding. Gideon, who was at the table with his coffee, did not set down his cup, but became very still in the immediate vicinity of it. "That's something your mama and I are still working out," Gideon said. Lily looked at him, looked at Naomi. The calculating look, the one that processed information with an accuracy that was sometimes startling in a 7-year-old. "Why?" she said. "It's complicated," Naomi said. "How?" Naomi sat down at the table. She looked at her daughter and tried to find the words that were honest without being more than a child needed. "Because your mama wants to make sure of things before she decides them," she said. "She's always done that." Lily considered this. "Porter didn't trust me right away either," she said. "I had to come every day." Naomi and Gideon both looked at her. "He trusts me now," Lily said, with the confidence of someone reporting a completed fact. She picked up her fork and addressed her breakfast with the air of someone who has made a contribution and is satisfied with it. Naomi looked at Gideon across the table. Gideon looked back at her with an expression that had several layers to it, and the top layer was something she recognized now well enough to name. It was the look of a man trying very hard not to smile at an inappropriate moment, and not entirely succeeding. "She's got a point," he said, very quietly. Naomi looked at her daughter, who was eating her eggs with complete self-possession, apparently unconcerned about the magnitude of what she'd just simplified. "She does," Naomi said. She looked at her coffee cup, then back at Gideon. "Let's talk about it, properly, this week." "Yes," he said. They looked at each other, and then they both looked at Lily, who had moved on to the biscuits and had the expression of someone who has done what needed doing and sees no reason to belabor it. Naomi felt the thing in her chest, the thing that had been breaking quietly for weeks, settle finally into its new shape. It was not the shape she'd had before Harold. It was not the shape she'd imagined when she was 14 and still believed in the cleaner versions of things. It was irregular and marked in places, and it had been through too much to lie flat anymore. But it was hers, and it was real, and sitting at this table in the early April morning light with her daughter, and this man who had come every day until she trusted him, she thought that perhaps a real shape, irregular and honest, was worth considerably more than a smooth one that told you nothing true about itself. She didn't say any of this. Some things were better left in the form of being known rather than being said. She poured herself more coffee and listened to Lily describe, in considerable detail, the specific personality of Porter as she understood it, and she let the morning be what it was. The proper conversation happened on a Wednesday evening after Lily was in bed. Naomi had known it was coming. They'd both known, since the breakfast table and Lily's pronouncement about Porter and the patience required to earn trust. The knowing had given the week a particular quality, like weather you can see building on the horizon before it arrives. Not dread, exactly. Something more complicated than that. The specific tension of a thing that matters being approached. Gideon poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat down at the table and said, So, she said. He turned his cup on the table. "I'm going to say something and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." "All right." "I meant what I said when you first arrived, that nothing here gets decided by force, that you have the right to walk away from this without owing me anything." He looked at her steadily. "That hasn't changed. I want to be clear about that before anything else." She nodded. "But I also want to tell you something that I haven't said directly, because I wasn't sure it would be useful to say, or whether it would feel like pressure." He paused. "I care about you. Not about the arrangement, not about what I paid for passage, or what the town expects, or what makes practical sense for the ranch. You and Lily." He stopped, started again more carefully. "I want you to stay because you want to be here, not because you don't have somewhere else to go." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." She wrapped her hands around her cup. Outside, the April wind was doing something to the cottonwood by the barn. A steady, low sound, like the house breathing. "I came here because I was desperate," she said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't, I didn't pick you out of a list because you seem promising. I picked you because your letter was the only one that didn't make me feel like cargo. Something moved in his face. The way you wrote about the ranch, she said. You wrote about the hawk's nest in the high pasture. You wrote about what the light does on the mountains at the end of the day. You weren't selling me anything. You were just describing where you lived. He was very still. That's how I knew, she said. Not that you were good. Not that you would be safe. I didn't know that. I couldn't have known it. But I knew that you were someone who paid attention to things that didn't have anything to do with what they could get you. And I thought, she stopped. I thought that might be something to build on. Was it? He asked. Yes, she said. It was. They sat with that for a moment, the coffee going slightly cooler between them. I want to stay, she said. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not still, that there aren't still parts of me that are watching for the thing that goes wrong, because there are. I don't know how long that takes to stop. As long as it takes, he said. But I want to stay, she said again, clearer. And I want to do this properly. The marriage. I want Lily to have that. A name and a family, and something that looks like permanence. She deserves that. She does, he agreed. So do you. Naomi looked at him. Don't say that yet, she said quietly. Let me get there on my own. He held her gaze. Okay, he said. I can do that. Good. She picked up her cup. Then let's talk about when. They decided on May, not the end of May, when the heat would be building and everyone would be thinking about summer, and the ceremony would feel like an afterthought to the season. Early May, when the territory was still green enough at the edges to be beautiful, and the air in the morning still had that particular clarity that came before the summer haze settled in for good. The preacher Gideon had mentioned, the one 3 counties over, the one he'd known 20 years, was a man named Aldous Hewitt, who arrived on a Thursday in the first week of May, driving his own wagon and wearing a coat that had been mended in several places with different colored thread, which told Naomi something about him before he'd said a word. He was a large man, somewhere in his 70s, with a white beard and the deliberate, unhurried quality of someone who had been in enough rooms with enough people to have stopped being impressed by the surface of things. He shook Naomi's hand like he was shaking a man's hand, full grip, direct, and he crouched down for Lily with the same unceremonious attention Gideon had shown at the stagecoach stop, months ago, that felt now like a different version of the world. You the one with the horse? He said to Lily. Lily looked at him. Porter, she said. Heard about you, Hewitt said. Hector's been talking. Hector talks too much, Lily said, which was both unfair and delivered with the confidence of a 7-year-old who knew she was the subject of a good story and found this satisfactory. Hewitt laughed, a full, unguarded sound, and stood back up. He stayed the night in the bunkhouse at his own insistence. He had supper at the main house and sat on the porch with Gideon until late, and Naomi, going to bed, heard the low cadence of 2 old friends talking, the sound of it weaving through the house in a way she found, unexpectedly, comforting. The ceremony was in the yard. Naomi had not wanted it inside. Inside felt contained, witnessable only by the immediate household, and she had decided, consciously, after some thought, that she wanted witnesses. Not because she needed the town's approval, which she had given up expecting in its full form and no longer required, but because a thing done privately in this situation could always be reduced later, made to seem provisional, made to seem like something that happened in a corner because it couldn't stand the light. She wanted it in the light. About 30 people came, some from the ranch's neighboring properties, families who'd had dealings with Gideon over the years, and had apparently decided that their opinion of him extended to whatever he chose to do. Hector and Esperanza. Dr. Alderman, who arrived with his wife and a handshake for Gideon that communicated several things without words. Miss Pratt, who came alone and stood at the back and had the expression of someone who has quietly arranged for something to go well and is now watching it do so. Even a few people from town whose presence surprised Naomi until she thought about it. People who had decided, in the slow and inexact way communities decide things, that their judgment of a situation had been premature. Mrs. Halloran was not among them. Neither was Burl Whitfield. Naomi noted this and found she had no strong feelings about it in either direction. Lily stood beside her mother. This was not, strictly speaking, traditional. Naomi hadn't planned it. She'd been thinking of Lily standing with Esperanza, off to the side, in the way that children at adult ceremonies usually stood, slightly apart from the central action. But Lily had arrived at her mother's side that morning, while Naomi was still getting dressed, in her own good dress with her dark hair braided with a ribbon that Esperanza had provided, carrying a small bunch of wildflowers that she had clearly picked herself from the edge of the garden because the stems were uneven and there was dirt on her hands. "Those are for you," she said, handing them to Naomi. Naomi took them. The flowers were a mixture of whatever had been growing at the garden's edge: desert marigold, a few sprigs of something blue and small, one stem of something that had already started to wilt but had apparently been included on the basis of color rather than structural integrity. "They're beautiful," Naomi said. "They're kind of messy," Lily said critically. "I should have brought the string." "They're perfect," Naomi said. Lily assessed her mother for a moment with the thoroughness that she brought to most assessments. "You're not scared," she said. It was an observation, not a question. Naomi thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "Not of him." "What of then?" "Of wanting something this much," Naomi said, which was more than she'd intended to say, and more honest than was perhaps strategic. But Lily nodded as though this made complete sense, which it probably did to a child who had spent several months deciding whether to believe that a horse's trust was real before allowing herself to fully want it. "It's okay to want it," Lily said. "I checked." Naomi looked at her daughter, 7 years old, with wildflowers in her dirt-stained hands and ribbon in her hair, delivering this pronouncement with the gravity of a small judge. "When did you check?" Naomi asked. "When I decided about Porter," Lily said simply, and then, "Can I stand next to you?" "Yes," Naomi said. "Stay right next to me." Aldous Hewitt did not conduct a long ceremony. He said what needed to be said, in plain language that didn't reach for poetry, but didn't avoid it when it was the right word. He spoke about two people choosing each other not because they had to, not because circumstances had arranged it and made the choosing feel inevitable, but because each of them had looked at the other clearly, with full knowledge of the difficulty and the imperfection and the accumulated weight of every other choice they'd both made, and had decided that this was still the thing they wanted. Naomi stood in the May morning light and listened to this and felt that it was true, and felt also the strange parallel sensation of it being surprising that it was true, and that these two feelings could occupy the same moment without canceling each other out. Gideon's hands were not entirely steady when he took hers. She noticed this and felt, with a clarity that went through her cleanly, that it mattered more than steadiness would have. This was not a man performing certainty. This was a man who was as genuinely moved as she was and making no effort to conceal it, and standing here with her in the full uncertainty of something that mattered too much to be comfortable. "I do," she said when the moment came. "I do," he said. Lily, standing at her mother's left side, held her wildflowers with both hands and watched everything with the focused, whole-body attention she brought to things that were important to her. Afterward, in the loose, relieved, slightly chaotic way of an outdoor gathering that has done its central business and is now operating on food and goodwill, Hector appeared from somewhere with a fiddle he'd apparently borrowed and had no legal business owning given how he played it, and Esperanza brought out the food she'd been preparing for 2 days, and the yard became something that was not quite a party, but was the version of it that these particular people in this particular place on this particular day could manage. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerably more than enough. Dr. Alderman found Naomi by the fence at one point, while Gideon was on the other side of the yard being congratulated by a neighboring rancher with a long and apparently complicated story to tell. Alderman stood beside her with his cup and looked out at the general state of the yard. "The arm healed well," he said, watching Lily from across the space. Lily was, at this moment, attempting to teach the fiddle tune to Porter through the paddock fence, which Porter was tolerating with the philosophical patience of a horse who has made his peace with many things. "Yes," Naomi said. "Kids heal faster than adults," he said. "Bones, anyway." He paused. "Some other things, too, if the conditions are right." Naomi looked at him. He looked back with the directness of a man who has something he wants to say and has decided to say it plainly. "I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 14 years, he said. "I've set a lot of bones and treated a lot of injuries that were described to me as accidents. He paused. I wrote up what I observed about Lily's injury. For your legal file. I wanted you to know I did it carefully. Thank you, Naomi said. And I want you to know. He stopped. Reconsidered. If Greer comes here, he said, he'll have more opposition than he's expecting. He may have counted on the isolation. He looked around at the yard, at the 30-odd people who had come to stand in the sun and witness this. He miscounted. Naomi looked at the yard too, at Hector sawing away at his borrowed fiddle with more enthusiasm than accuracy, at Esperanza talking to Miss Pratt with the comfortable ease of two women who had each spent years doing necessary work without adequate recognition, at Gideon, across the yard, who glanced over at her at this particular moment and caught her eye and held it for just a second. Not long, not theatrical, just the small daily acknowledgement of two people who have agreed to keep track of each other. He did, she said. Miscounted. Harold Greer arrived on a Friday afternoon in the third week of May. Not alone. He came with a man who styled himself a legal representative, though Emmett Crane's subsequent assessment of the man's credentials was that he would be very good at writing letters and substantially less useful in front of any actual judge. He also came with the particular manner he'd always had, the easy, expansive authority of a man who walks into situations already certain of the outcome. He pulled up at the ranch yard in a hired buggy, and Naomi saw him coming from the garden where she'd been working, and she put down the trowel, and she did not go to get Gideon. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the yard. Greer got down from the buggy and looked around the ranch with the calculating appraisal of someone pricing things. He was older than she remembered, or she was seeing him differently now. She wasn't certain which. The same heavy build, the same quality of a man who had always been the largest person in any room he entered and had organized his understanding of the world around that fact. But standing in Gideon's yard in the May afternoon light, he looked like something she could see the dimensions of. He looked at her face. She'd known he'd do that. Look for the bruise, look for the evidence of his prior work. He found none. Naomi, he said with the familiar expansiveness, you're looking well. Mr. Greer, she said. He gestured at the man beside him. This is Mr. Doyle. He's here in a legal capacity. I know why you're here, Naomi said, and I'm going to say this clearly, once, so there's no confusion. Lily is my daughter. You have no legal relationship to her and no legal claim. That has been documented through the county court and through the offices of Emmett Crane, who is our attorney, and who has copies of everything that supports that position. Greer's expression went through something, the performance of patience wearing thin. Now, Naomi, we're not done, she said. Dr. Alderman, who is the physician in this town, has written a detailed account of the nature of Lily's injury when we arrived here. That account is also on file. It describes specifically how the bone was broken and what the healing pattern indicated about the nature of the force applied. The man Doyle shifted his weight slightly. Greer did not. His expression had settled into something flat, the look of a man deciding how to reconfigure. A child falls, he said. These things happen. There are 2 women in New Mexico, Naomi said, who made complaints to the county sheriff about you. I know their names. Emmett Crane knows their names. If you pursue any legal action regarding my daughter, those names and those complaints become part of the record. She looked at him directly. I'm not threatening you. I'm explaining the terrain. The yard was quiet except for the ordinary ranch sounds. Somewhere behind her, in the barn, Porter shifting in his stall. Somewhere further, the sound of Hector at some chore she couldn't see. Greer looked at her for a long moment. This was the moment she'd been preparing for since January, since the letter, since before that even, this specific silence, this specific calculation running behind his eyes. You've gotten yourself some help, he said finally. His voice was careful. Found yourself a man with property. I found myself a husband, she said, and a lawyer, and a doctor willing to testify, and a town that was here when Lily and I arrived and has been watching us every day since. She paused. You came here thinking you'd find us the same way we left. We're not. Naomi. He used the particular tone, the one she'd heard 10,000 times, the patient, slightly aggrieved tone of a man recalibrating. I raised you. You were appointed my guardian, she said, by a court that made an error of judgment. You were never my family. You were never Lily's anything. She looked at him with a steadiness that had taken years to develop, and that she would not spend cheaply. "You should leave. I think you know you should leave." Doyle said something quiet to Greer. Naomi didn't catch the words, but she read the tone. Caution, the assessing quality of a man who has looked at the legal terrain and found it less hospitable than his client had represented. Greer looked at her for another moment. He was trying to find the thing that would change the shape of this encounter, the lever, the opening. She watched him look, and she let him look, and she held herself exactly where she was. He didn't find it. "Fine," he said at last. The word was small and tight and cost him something. "We'll revisit this through proper legal channels. Mr. Crane will be happy to correspond with Mr. Doyle," Naomi said. "Good afternoon." She watched them turn the buggy. She watched them go back down the approach road in the direction of town. She stood in the yard until the dust of them was gone. Then she sat down on the porch steps, because her legs had decided that standing could be someone else's problem for a moment, and she put her face in her hands, and she stayed there until the shaking stopped. She heard the screen door behind her, footsteps. Gideon sat down beside her on the step. "Hector told me," he said. I watched from the barn." She lowered her hands. "I told you I needed to be the one who—" "I know, I stayed in the barn." He paused. "You were right about how to handle him. I could see it from 50 yards away." She looked out at the approach road, empty now, the dust settling back to nothing. "He'll write letters," she said. "Doyle will write letters to Crane. It'll go on for a while." "Let it go on," Gideon said. We've got a lawyer, and we've got time." She turned her head and looked at him. This man sitting on his own porch step in the late afternoon, with the easy patience of someone who had stayed in the barn because she'd asked him to, who had watched and not interfered because he trusted her to know the shape of the thing better than he did. "You stayed in the barn," she said. "You said to." "Most men wouldn't have." He looked out at the road. "Most men wouldn't know what they were looking at," he said. "I knew what I was looking at." She sat with that for a moment. The shaking had fully stopped now. The afternoon light was doing what it did at this hour, going golden and long across the yard, making everything look more considered than it probably was. "He's not coming back," she said. Not a question. Something she was deciding as she said it. "No," Gideon agreed. "I don't think he is." She breathed out, long and slow, the kind of breath that moves something that's been lodged too long. "Lily's at school," she said. "She'll be home in an hour." Naomi nodded. She looked at the vegetable garden, which had come in well this spring, better than Esperanza had expected. The beans were climbing their stakes. The squash was sprawling in the particular greedy way of squash that believes the entire garden is correctly its territory. She'd planted those beans herself, in March. In soil she'd turned herself with a fork she'd had to ask Hector where to find. "I planted things here," she said, which was not precisely about the garden. "I know," Gideon said. She stood up from the step, because there was still supper to think about, and Porter needed checking, and Lily would be home in an hour, and the day was not finished with its ordinary requirements. She looked down at Gideon, still sitting on the step, looking out at the yard with the particular comfortable quality of a man in a place that is genuinely his. "Come in when you're ready," she said. She went back inside. Behind her, the screen door closed with its familiar sound, the sound the house made in the evenings, and the afternoon went on being what it was, light and warmth and the smell of growing things from the garden, and beneath all of it, running through the whole day like a thread through cloth, the quiet, radical fact of safety. On the day Lily came home from school 2 weeks after Greer's visit, she came through the door faster than usual and dropped her slate on the table with a clatter that indicated news. "Miss Pratt says I have the best handwriting in the second years," she announced. "Does she?" Naomi said. "She showed it to everyone." Lily's voice had that quality it sometimes had now, the unguarded quality, the one that surfaced when she forgot to watch herself. She held it up. Naomi was at the counter and she kept her back to her daughter for a moment because she needed that moment. "That's because you practice," she said. "All those letters you've been writing on the back of the old almanac pages." "Gideon said I could have the new ones when they come," Lily said. "The almanac pages. He said I could have the ones in the back that are blank." "That was generous of him." "I know." Lily sat down at the table and picked up her slate and looked at it critically. "I'm going to practice the capital letters. The capital Q is still not right. Naomi turned around and looked at her daughter. 7 years old, with ink on her fingers and dirt from the schoolyard on her hem, and her hair coming out of its braid the way it always did by the end of the day, sitting at this table in this kitchen, in this house, in the Arizona territory, exercising her critical judgment on the capital Q. Some things did not have the right words. She had learned this, too, in the last months, that the most important things were often exactly that way, existing in the space where language got insufficient, and you had to let the knowing be wordless. She went back to the counter and started on supper, and Lily practiced her letters, and outside the late May afternoon moved through the yard in long, warm light, and the house held both of them in its ordinary, imperfect, entirely sufficient way. Doyle's letters came, as Naomi had predicted, and they came with the particular frequency of a man being paid by the word. 3 in June, 2 in July, each one slightly more attenuated than the last. The legal language growing thinner and more qualified with each iteration the way broth thins when you keep adding water. Emmett Crane responded to each one with the precise economy of a man who charged by the hour and had made his position clear the first time and saw no reason to elaborate. By August, the correspondence had stopped entirely. Crane sent a short note. No further communication received. Consider the matter closed unless they reopen it. Gideon read it at the breakfast table and set it down and poured more coffee without comment. "It's done," Naomi said. "For now," he said, not to be difficult, but because he'd learned that she preferred the honest version to the comfortable one, and this was his version of honest, not assuming a thing was over until it had been over long enough to prove it. She appreciated that. It was one of the many small things she'd collected over the months, this habit of his, the refusal to manufacture a certainty he didn't have. "For now," she agreed. Lily, who was eating her breakfast with the focused industry of someone who had somewhere to be, school had resumed after the summer break, and she had strong opinions about punctuality that appeared to have developed independently of any adult instruction, looked up from her plate. "Is it about that man?" she asked. "Yes," Naomi said. "Is he coming back?" "No." Lily returned to her breakfast. "Good," she said, with a completeness that closed the subject. And that was the last time Harold Greer's name was spoken at that table. The summer on the ranch had its own rhythm, and Naomi had learned it the way she'd learned the other rhythms, by observation and then by absorption, until it stopped being something she was watching and became something she was part of. The days ran long and hot, and full of the particular hard work of keeping a cattle operation alive through an Arizona summer. Water hauling, fence maintenance, the constant monitoring of the herd's condition, the 1,000 small decisions that Gideon made without apparent deliberation because he'd been making them for so long they'd become instinct. She did not stay in the house. This was something that had happened gradually, without formal announcement. She'd simply begun going where the work was, first in the garden, then in the larger operations of the ranch, learning what she could manage and what required more experience than she had, and asking, when she needed to ask, without apology. Hector had taught her to read the water signs in the soil. Gideon had shown her the fence line that ran along the eastern pasture and explained which posts needed replacing and why. She'd helped with 2 cattle drives shorter than she'd expected and longer than she'd prepared for and come back from both of them with saddle sores and the particular satisfaction of having done something difficult. "You're going to be a better rider than me inside 2 years, Gideon told her, after the second drive, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a weather forecast. "Don't say that to Lily," Naomi said. "She'll consider it a competition." "It already is a competition," he said. "Lily decided that in April." He wasn't wrong. Lily on horseback was something that people in the immediate territory had begun to notice and remark on. The way she sat, the way she communicated with Porter through some private language of weight and balance that the horse appeared to understand completely. She was 8 now, taller, with the lean look of a child who spent most of her waking hours in motion, and she had Miss Pratt's complete academic endorsement and the ranch hand's complete affection and the general admiration of every horse she'd ever been introduced to. She also had her mother's habit of assessment, her mother's precision of observation, and her mother's particular quality of patience that could turn, without warning, into a decisive action that nobody had seen coming. This last quality was demonstrated one August morning when Lily came to find Naomi in the kitchen with the serious expression she wore when something required adult attention. "The colt in the south pasture," she said. "He's got wire. Naomi put down what she was holding. Where's Gideon? Far fence. Hector's with him. Lily was already moving back toward the door. I can show you. The colt, one of 3 that had been born that spring, this one belonging to a mare named Bucket, who had the disposition of a woman who finds most situations mildly irritating, had gotten a length of old fence wire wrapped around his left rear leg. He was down in the corner of the pasture, sweating and trembling, with Bucket standing over him in the anxious, helpless way of a mother who can see the problem and cannot solve it. Naomi assessed the situation and sent Lily at a flat run for the fence cutters she'd seen hanging in the barn, and she went to the colt the way Gideon had showed her to approach a distressed horse, wide arc, low approach, voice steady and continuous even when there was nothing meaningful to say. By the time Lily came back with the cutters, Naomi had the colt's head calmed enough to work. She cut the wire in 3 places. Her hands were not quite steady, and she nicked herself on one of the cuts. Nothing serious, just the sharp small payment that wire always seemed to require. And the colt was on his feet within minutes, shaky but intact, Bucket immediately nosing at him with the aggressive concern of a mother who has been badly frightened and is converting it to irritation. Lily stood at the pasture fence watching all of this. When Naomi came back through the gate, Lily looked at her hand. You're bleeding, she said. I'm aware. Does it hurt? Some, Naomi said. Lily looked at the colt, now being bullied back toward the center of the pasture by his mother. You didn't stop, she said. No. Because the colt needed it more. Yes. Lily was quiet for a moment, and that way she had of processing something with her whole attention before responding. I'm going to tell Gideon you did it, she said, because he should know. Naomi wrapped her hand in a strip torn from the hem of her work shirt. Tell him about the wire too, she said. That section of fence needs replacing. Lily nodded with the air of someone whose message has been expanded but not fundamentally altered, and she went to find Gideon, and Naomi stood in the August heat with her wrapped hand and the colt moving cautiously in the middle of the pasture and the ordinary enormity of the day continuing around her. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 10 months ago and could not have done what she'd just done. Not because she'd lacked the capability, but because capability without confidence is a tool you can't find when you need it. She thought about the way confidence had come, not suddenly, not in a revelation, but in exactly the way Gideon had described on the porch that January night, one thing at a time, until the warning system started to recognize what safe looked like and began, slowly, to stand down. She flexed her cut hand. It stung cleanly. She went back to the house to find proper bandaging. She discovered she was pregnant on a Wednesday in September. She'd known for about 2 weeks before she allowed herself to know it, which was its own kind of information about how far she'd come and how far she still had to go. The symptoms were unmistakable. She'd been pregnant before. She understood what her body was doing. But she'd spent 2 weeks finding other explanations for each one individually, constructing an architecture of alternative conclusions that required more effort to maintain than just admitting the truth. What she was doing, she understood, was trying to determine how she felt before she had to say it out loud to anyone, including herself. She was not afraid. That was the first thing she understood. She'd been afraid the first time, profoundly and with good reason, because the first time she'd been 22 and alone with someone who would see a pregnancy as a problem to be managed. This time she was in a house with a man who had stayed in a barn because she'd asked him to, and a daughter who would receive this news with the full gravity of her assessment capabilities, and enough ground under her feet that she could feel where she stood. She was something closer to stunned. The particular stunned quality of someone who keeps expecting the ground to give way and has been walking on solid stone all along. She told Gideon on a Thursday evening. They were on the porch, where they seemed to have their most significant conversations, she'd noticed, as though the open air and the falling dark made certain kinds of honesty more possible than the enclosed spaces inside. She'd been trying to work out how to say it all day, and had decided that working out how to say it was the wrong approach, that the point was simply to say it. I'm going to have a baby, she said. Gideon turned to look at her. She looked back at him and waited, because whatever came next would be real, and she'd trained herself not to fill silences that needed to breathe. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she hadn't seen before, something moving through him that was large enough that he needed a moment to find the form for it. His hand, resting on the arm of his chair, moved toward her and then stopped halfway, as though he'd remembered in the middle of the gesture that he should let her lead. She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Okay," he said, in a voice that was not quite steady, and that was the entirety of what he said, and it was exactly right. "I'm not scared," she told him. "I need you to know that. I'm not scared of it." "I know," he said. Then, "I might be. A little." She looked at him. "You? We didn't have children, Eleanor and I. I told you we wanted them. It just didn't—" He paused. "I don't know how to do this." "Nobody does," she said. "You work it out as you go." "That's a terrifying system," he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but it's the only one available." He held her hand in the dark of the porch, and the Arizona night did its vast, indifferent thing around them. And after a while she said, "We have to tell Lily." "How do you think she'll take it?" Naomi considered her daughter seriously, which was the only way she knew to consider her. "I think," she said slowly, "that she's going to have opinions about the name." Lily's reaction to the news was a pause of approximately 4 seconds, followed by, "Is it going to sleep in my room?" "No," Naomi said. "It'll have the small room at the end of the hall. That was going to be my reading room." "I know. We'll find you somewhere else to read." Lily considered this negotiation with the expression of someone evaluating a settlement offer. "Gideon's study has the good window," she said. Gideon, who was sitting at the kitchen table and had been watching this exchange with the attention of someone observing a natural phenomenon, said, "You can use the study in the evenings." Lily nodded once, the settlement accepted. Then she looked at her mother with the more unguarded expression, the one that lived underneath the calculating one, the one she was slowly learning she was allowed to show. "Is it going to be okay?" she asked. "You and the baby." "I intend to make sure of that," Naomi said. "Dr. Alderman is good," Lily said, apparently having given this independent thought. "He fixed my arm." "He did," Naomi agreed. Lily nodded again, this time with the air of someone who has reviewed the relevant evidence and reached a conclusion. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to tell Porter." She was out the back door before either adult could formulate a response to this, and they could hear her boots on the steps, and then the particular sound of her crossing the yard toward the barn, and Naomi and Gideon sat in the kitchen in the aftermath of it. "She's going to be extraordinary," Gideon said. "She already is," Naomi said. Odd. The pregnancy was not easy. She'd known it might not be. She was 25 now, not 22, and the winters and the physical work and the accumulated stress of the last several years had left their marks in ways that didn't always show on the surface. The first 3 months brought a nausea that was indiscriminate about the hour. It had no preference for morning, was happy to arrive at midday or evening or 3 in the morning with equal enthusiasm, and a fatigue that she found more frightening than the nausea because Naomi did not like not being capable. Gideon did not hover. She would have found hovering intolerable, and he knew this, and so he found other ways to be useful that didn't require her to acknowledge needing help. Wood for the stove appeared without comment. The heaviest work in the kitchen redistributed itself to Esperanza, who had strong opinions about the correct way to do things anyway, and accepted the additional responsibility with the air of someone who has been waiting to be given proper authority. Gideon's checks on the garden, which had always been occasional, became daily, framed always as a personal interest in the squash. She saw through all of it and said nothing, because being seen through a kindness was not the same as being managed by it. Dr. Alderman came to the ranch monthly, which he framed as a professional call, and which was more frequent than the situation strictly required, but which Naomi accepted because she was not going to be foolish about this. He was direct with her, which she required. He told her what was normal and what required attention, and what was the sort of thing that happened in pregnancies that resolved itself without intervention, and what was the sort of thing that didn't. "Your blood pressure," he said, at the December visit, with the careful tone of a man choosing his words for their accuracy rather than their comfort. "It's higher than I'd like." She looked at him. "Not dangerously high. Not yet." He looked at his notes. "But you need to reduce the physical load significantly." "I have a ranch." "I know you do." He met her eyes. "I'm telling you the ranch's needs and the baby's needs are not compatible at the same level of activity you've been maintaining. You'll need to choose what you do and what you delegate." She did not fight him on this because she was not someone who fought against clear evidence. She made the adjustments. She stepped back from the outdoor work with a reluctance that she felt physically, in the way of someone asked to give up a tool they'd only recently learned to use well. She increased the indoor work, which was not what she'd have chosen, but was what was available. Lily noticed the change and said nothing about it directly, but her trips to the barn became longer, and her reports on Porter's condition more detailed, which was her way of filling the gap without calling attention to it. One evening in January, the year turning over, 1885. Arriving without ceremony. Naomi was sitting in the front room with her feet up on Gideon's explicit instruction and the novel she'd been trying to read for 2 months open in her lap, making very little progress because her mind kept moving faster than the page. When Lily came and sat on the footstool beside her, she didn't say anything immediately, just sat. Naomi looked at her daughter, 9 years old now, grown considerably in the 15 months since they'd arrived. Not just in the measurable ways, in height and the length of her arms, and the fact that her face was losing the last of its early childhood roundness, but in all the other ways that didn't have measurements. She sat with a comfort in her own body that she hadn't had when they'd arrived. She occupied the house with an ease that had taken months to develop. "Are you scared?" Lily asked, finally. Naomi thought about being honest versus being reassuring and chose honest because it was Lily. "Sometimes," she said, "not about the baby, about doing it right." "You do most things right," Lily said. "Not all of them." "No," Lily agreed with the candor that Naomi had always encouraged and occasionally regretted. "But the important ones." Naomi looked at her daughter. "The arm," Lily said. She almost never brought it up directly, and when she did it was with this particular flatness, not avoidance, but the matter-of-fact quality of someone who has processed something and filed it in its correct place. "You got me out. That was the important one." "Yes," Naomi said. "So." Lily straightened on the footstool with the air of someone closing a ledger. "You'll probably do this one right, too." She went back to her own reading. She'd commandeered Gideon's study for the evening, as had become her custom, and was working through a natural history book she'd found on the shelves that had clearly been there for years without being opened, which she considered both a personal discovery and a minor tragedy. And Naomi sat with the novel in her lap and thought about what it meant that her 9-year-old had just delivered the most effective reassurance she'd received in the entire pregnancy. The baby came in April. Not easily. There was nothing easy about it. Alderman had prepared her for this, had said in December that her blood pressure and the baby's position and a range of other factors he'd been monitoring made this a delivery that was going to require attention and management and more time than a straightforward one. He'd been accurate. It was a long night and then a longer morning. Esperanza stayed in the room, which Naomi had not planned, and was grateful for in the way you're grateful for things you didn't know you needed. Alderman was steady and precise and spoke to Naomi in the direct way she'd asked him always to speak to her, telling her what was happening and what was required of her without softening it into something less than the truth. Gideon stayed in the kitchen. He stayed there for 11 hours, which Hector knew because Hector stayed with him, the way old friends stay. Not talking much, not filling the space with words that weren't going to help, just being present in the same room so the waiting had company. At one point, around 3 a.m, Gideon said, There are things I should have done differently." Hector, who was on his 3rd cup of coffee and who had known Gideon Cross for going on 12 years, said, "She's not Eleanor." Gideon was quiet. "Eleanor was sick," Hector said. "Before she was sick, she was already sick. This is different." He looked at his coffee. "Naomi's strong. You know how strong she is." "I know," Gideon said. "That doesn't—" "No," Hector agreed. "It doesn't. You're still going to sit here and wait, but it's different." They sat in the kitchen until the April dawn started on the eastern window, and then Alderman came through the door with his sleeves rolled down and the particular expression of a man who has done the work, and the work came out right. "A boy," he said. "Both of them fine." Gideon stood up from the table. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, not moving, the way a man stands when something large has happened and his body hasn't caught up to the information yet. Hector put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Then he went outside because the horses needed feeding, and the morning was starting, and some things were private. The boy was named James. Not after anyone. They discuss names in the abstract way of people who are superstitious enough not to be too specific before the time comes. And James had been on a short list. And when Naomi held him for the first time in the April morning light, he looked, she said, like a James, which was not a criterion Gideon had any way to evaluate, but which he accepted immediately as the right call. He was a small baby, given what the delivery had cost, and he was loud in the particular way of healthy babies who find the world insufficiently accommodating to their preferences. Naomi was exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix in a single night, or several nights, and she was also, Gideon observed without saying, visibly, wholly, in possession of herself in a way that was different from exhaustion and different from happiness and more fundamental than either. Lily met her brother on a Sunday morning, standing at the side of the bed with her hands clasped in front of her, looking at the small red bundle with the concentrated attention she brought to new things. "He's smaller than I expected," she said. "They generally are," Naomi said. "Does he understand things yet?" "Not in the way you mean. He understands warmth and sound, and whether he's hungry." Lily considered this. "So basically like Porter when I first started," she said. Naomi made a sound that was suppressed laughter converting itself imperfectly. "Something like that," she said, "though I'd leave that comparison out when you talk to him later." Lily reached out one careful finger and touched the baby's hand. James, with the indiscriminate reflexive grip of the newly born, closed his fingers around hers. Something crossed Lily's face, something large and unguarded and entirely new, the expression of someone who has not been prepared for the specific quality of the thing that's just happened. She held very still. "He's holding on," she said very quietly. "Yes," Naomi said. Lily stood there with her finger in her brother's grip, and she did not pull away, and she did not say anything else for a while. And the morning light came through the window in the particular April way and fell across the bed, and both of them, and Naomi, watching, felt the shape of her family complete itself in some way that she hadn't known it was still building toward. It was not perfect. Nothing about any of it was perfect. James would be a difficult baby for the first 3 months, a fact that was going to make the summer considerably more complicated than they were planning for, and Naomi's recovery was going to take longer than she'd want and shorter than Alderman feared. And Lily was going to have strong opinions about the order of bath times that would require formal negotiation. Hector's joints were getting worse, and the south fence needed a proper overhaul before winter, and the cattle market in the territory was doing something complicated that Gideon had not yet finished worrying about. All of that was coming. All of that was the actual texture of a life, as opposed to the idea of one. But in this room, in this light, with her daughter's finger in her son's grip, and the sound of Gideon's boots on the stairs as he came to see them all together for the first time, Naomi held the whole of it, the imperfect, the unfinished, the still requiring work of it. And she held it without flinching, which was the thing she'd been learning to do all along. This was what she'd come here for. Not exactly this. She couldn't have imagined exactly this that October morning on the stagecoach. But this. The being somewhere real. The having something worth protecting that she hadn't had to lose anything essential to get. Gideon came through the door and stopped. He looked at Lily, at James, at Naomi. She looked back at him. "Come in," she said. "Come see your son." He sat on the edge of the bed, and Naomi put James in his arms, and Gideon held his son for the first time with the careful, slightly overwhelmed quality of a man handling something that matters too much to be casual about. And Lily stood at the foot of the bed and watched all of it with her whole self, the way she watched things that were important. The room was full. Not just with the four of them, with all the months that had made them possible, all the decisions and the distances and the fear that had been worth walking through, because this was on the other side of it, full and warm and real. James learned to walk in the summer of 1885, at 10 months old, which was early enough that Dr. Alderman noted it with the restrained approval of a man who does not distribute praise carelessly. He took his first steps across the kitchen floor on a Tuesday morning while Naomi was at the counter and Lily was at the table with her school books. And the event announced itself not with fanfare but with Lily saying, flatly and with considerable authority, "He's walking." Naomi turned. James was crossing 3 feet of kitchen floor with the concentrated, full-body commitment of someone attempting something that requires everything they have. His arms were out. His expression was the expression of a person who has decided on a destination and is not interested in discussing alternatives. He made it 4 steps before sitting down hard on the floorboards, looked at the sitting down with mild surprise, and then looked up at his sister. Again, Lily told him, with the tone she used when she was teaching him something, which was the tone of someone who had strong opinions about the correct way to do a thing and was prepared to supervise until it was done correctly. James, who at 10 months had already determined that Lily's instructions generally led somewhere worth going, pulled himself back to standing, using the table leg, and tried again. By the time Gideon came in from the morning rounds, his son was crossing the kitchen under his own power with increasing confidence, and Lily was sitting on the floor at the far end of it, with her arms open, providing a destination, and Naomi was standing at the counter not pretending to do anything else. Gideon stood in the doorway and watched. "He walked," Naomi said. "I can see that." His voice had that quality it got sometimes, the quality she'd learned to recognize over the 2 years of their marriage, the one that meant something large was happening in him that he wasn't going to make a production of. He watched his son navigate the kitchen with the effortful, whole-body determination of the newly upright, and his face did the thing it did. She'd never found a word for exactly what his face did in these moments. She'd stopped looking for one. Some things were more completely themselves without a word attached. The years did what years do, which is arrive without announcement and leave without adequate warning. James at 2 was opinionated and loud and had Porter's exact same attitude about carrots, which he rejected on what appeared to be aesthetic rather than practical grounds. He followed Lily with the devoted single-mindedness of a small animal that has decided on its person, and Lily, who had negotiated the terms of his arrival with the pragmatism of a lawyer and the wariness of someone who had been an only child for 9 years, had accepted him with a completeness that surprised even her. She taught him the birds first, the same way Naomi had taught her. The names, the calls, the difference between the ones that were passing through and the ones that had decided the territory was worth staying in. James learned Mockingbird before he learned most people's names, which Naomi thought was probably fine, and Gideon thought was definitely fine. The ranch grew in the way ranches grow when they're managed well, and the seasons cooperate more than they fight, slowly, accumulatively, through the compound interest of good decisions and adequate luck and the daily work of people who know what they're doing. Gideon added the North Pasture in 1886, a negotiation with the neighboring Aldrich family that took 4 months and 3 failed dinners, and ultimately resolved because Naomi pointed out a legal provision in the original land grant that neither Gideon nor the Aldriches had known was there, at which point everyone agreed that the negotiation had been settled and the dinner could finally be enjoyed. "Where did you learn that?" Gideon asked her on the ride home. "Emmett Crane," she said. "I've been reading his lending library." He looked at her. "The legal volumes," she said. "He said I could borrow them." "Does he know you've been reading his lending library?" "He suggested it," she said. "He said I had a better instinct for documentation than most people he'd trained formally." She paused. "I think he meant it as a compliment." "It is a compliment," Gideon said. "Crane doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She looked at the road ahead, at the dark mountains and the enormous Arizona sky, doing its usual thing with the last of the evening light. "I've been thinking," she said, "about whether there's a way to be useful, beyond the ranch." He waited. "Women come through here," she said, "through Cutter's Bend, through the territory. Some of them on their way to arrangements like the one I came here on. Some of them already in situations like the one I left." She paused. "They don't know what I know, about the legal dimensions, about what documentation exists and what can be created." She looked at him. "I wasted years not knowing what my actual legal position was, because nobody told me, because nobody who knew thought it was their business to tell me." Gideon drove the wagon in the particular quality of attention that meant he was taking something seriously. "You're thinking about telling them," he said. "I'm thinking about making it my business," she said. He nodded slowly. "Talk to Crane." "I already have. Informally." She looked at the road. "He thinks there's a framework for it, a more formal role. Not legal practice, I'm not suggesting that. But information, documentation assistance, helping women understand what recourse they actually have versus what they've been told they have." Gideon looked out at the darkening territory. "Burl Whitfield's going to have opinions," he said. Burl Whitfield always has opinions, she said. I haven't found them useful yet. He made the sound that was his version of a laugh when something was both true and somewhat grim. No, he said. Neither have I. They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence that had become one of the specific textures of their life. Not empty, not avoidant, but the silence of two people who had talked enough to know when talking wasn't what the moment needed. The work with Emmett Crane began formally in the spring of 1887. It had no official name. Crane referred to it, in his correspondence, as documentation assistance, which was accurate if incomplete. What it actually was, in practice, was Naomi sitting across from women, at Crane's office, sometimes at the ranch, once in the back room of the general store after Mrs. Halloran had surprised everyone, including herself, by offering it, and explaining clearly and without the particular gentleness that sometimes made clarity impossible, what the law said versus what circumstances had led them to believe. Some of these conversations were straightforward. Some of them were not. Some of them involved women who had been told for so long that they had no options that the information about options had to be delivered slowly, in pieces, with time built in for the reality of it to settle before the next piece could be added. Naomi was good at this in the way you're good at things that you've lived through rather than studied. Not from theory, but from the inside of knowing what it meant to have the information withheld and what it meant to finally have it. Word moved in the particular way word moves in small territorial communities, through the networks that men didn't know existed, through the channels that operated alongside the visible structures rather than through them. Women came from other towns, from the outlying ranches, from circumstances that Naomi recognized in the specific posture and the careful eyes and the way they positioned themselves in a chair with one part of their attention always on the door. She recognized it because she had sat exactly that way in Emmett Crane's office herself 4 years prior, and she had not forgotten what it had cost her to sit still through that first conversation. She told Gideon about these conversations in the evenings, in general terms, not the specifics that weren't hers to share. He listened. He asked the questions he could helpfully ask, and didn't ask the ones that would have been about his own understanding rather than hers. She had not expected, when she married him, to find that being listened to would feel like such a specific and unusual thing. She had not expected that it would continue to feel that way, rather than becoming ordinary. It became ordinary, but it didn't stop mattering. Lily was 12 when she informed the household that she intended to become a veterinarian. She said it at the supper table with the flat declaration of someone who has already completed the deliberation and is not presenting the conclusion for debate. James, who was 3, looked up from his food with the attention he gave things that seemed important to Lily, and then went back to his food. Naomi looked at her daughter. "There are schools," Lily said. "Crane helped me look into it. There's one in Philadelphia. There's one that's starting in Chicago." She had a folded piece of paper beside her plate, which she produced and unfolded with the air of someone presenting the documentation for a legal argument. "Crane says that by the time I'm ready, if I complete what Miss Pratt is preparing me for, and then the secondary schooling in Tucson, the field will be different, more open." "Crane has been helping you research this," Naomi said. "Since March," Lily said. "I didn't want to bring it up before I had the full picture." Naomi looked across the table at Gideon. Gideon was looking at Lily with an expression that had several layers, the top one being the expression of a man looking at a 12-year-old who had been doing independent research since March, and hadn't mentioned it until she had the full picture, which was an expression that contained a complicated mixture of admiration and the foreknowledge of an expensive future. "Philadelphia's far," he said. "It's where the school is," Lily said. "You're 12. "I'm aware. It won't be for years. I'm telling you now so there's time to plan for it financially." She looked at her paper. "Crane gave me some figures." "Of course he did," Gideon said. Naomi put down her fork. She looked at her daughter, this 12-year-old with her research and her figures and her knowledge of where the schools were, who had arrived in Arizona Territory 6 years ago with a broken arm and a face that had learned not to show what it was thinking. And she felt something that she thought, when she examined it, was probably the purest form of pride available to a parent. Not the comfortable kind, not the kind that was really about the parent's own reflection. The kind that was about the person in front of you being entirely, specifically, irreducibly themselves. "Well, look at the figures," Naomi said. Lily refolded her paper with the satisfied air of someone whose presentation has been received as intended. James, who had finished his food and had been waiting with the patience of a 3-year-old, which was a patience measured in very short intervals, said, "Lily's going somewhere?" "Not for a long time," Lily told him. "Good," he said, and returned to the business of trying to balance his cup on his fork, which was the current engineering project. Later, after the children were in bed, Naomi and Gideon sat on the porch in the warm spring dark, and Gideon said, "Philadelphia." "Philadelphia," Naomi agreed. "She'll go," he said. "Yes. And she'll be good at it." "She'll be remarkable at it," Naomi said. "You know she will." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't seem worried." "I'm terrified," she said. "She's 12 and she's already planning to leave, and she's completely right that she should." She looked at the dark yard, the familiar shape of the barn against the star-thick sky. That's the thing they don't tell you about raising someone to be capable. At some point, the capability takes them somewhere you can't follow. "Was that what happened with you?" he asked. Not intrusively. The way he asked the things he asked, as though the question were an offering, something she could take or leave. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "The capability came late for me, after everything else." She paused. "I don't want that for her. I want the capability to come first while she still has options about where it takes her." He looked at the night. "It's already working," he said quietly. "What you wanted for her. You can see it." She could see it. That was exactly the thing. She could see it clearly. The person Lily was becoming, and it was not the person who had sat rigid on the stagecoach with her arm in a splint, and it was not the person Naomi had feared she might become if the first years left marks that couldn't be worked through. It was someone new, assembled from everything that had happened and everything that had come after, the whole complicated inheritance of a childhood that had been hard and then had become something else. You could not undo the hard part. Naomi had learned this, and it had taken longer to learn than she would have liked. The hard part existed. It was real. It had shaped things in ways that were not always convenient or comfortable. But the hard part was not the whole of it, and it was not the loudest part anymore. And watching Lily present her veterinary research at the supper table with her folded paper and her knowledge of Philadelphia, Naomi thought that was perhaps the most any parent could honestly hope for. Not a childhood without damage. A person who had moved through the damage toward something that was genuinely and entirely their own. Harold Greer died in the spring of 1889. Emmett Crane brought the news, having received word through his legal contacts in New Mexico. A brief notice, the kind that circulated through professional channels when estates needed settling. Natural causes, apparently. He had been 61. Naomi received this information at Crane's office on a Thursday morning and sat with it for a while after Crane had said what he'd said, in the quiet way he had of saying difficult things. "I'm not sure what I feel," she said, which was honest. "That's a reasonable response," Crane said. "I thought I'd feel something clearer." She looked at the window, at the main street of Cutter's Bend going about its Thursday business. "Relief, maybe, or something like satisfaction." She paused. "I mostly feel like a door closed on a room I'd already stopped going into." Crane nodded. He understood things without requiring them to be explained further, which was one of the reasons she'd trusted him from the beginning. "It doesn't change anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't need to." She walked back to the ranch that afternoon under the April sky, which was doing what the April sky did. That specific clarity, the quality of light she'd first seen when they'd ridden out here from the stagecoach stop more than 5 years ago, which had seemed then like a sky that expected something of you. She'd been right about that, she thought. It did expect something. It expected you to be present in it, to be actually in the place you were in, rather than preparing for departure. She'd learned to be present. It had taken a while. It was still something she worked at, on the days when the old habits of vigilance ran louder than the present evidence warranted. But she worked at it, and that was the difference between who she'd been on that stagecoach and who she was walking home under this sky. She told Gideon that evening. Told him the same way she'd told Crane, plainly, because that was the only way she knew to say it anymore. He listened. He said, "How are you?" "I'm all right," she said. "I think I'm genuinely all right." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I'm as surprised as you are." James was 5 when he asked Naomi about her face. Not the face she had now. He meant the face in the photograph. There was a photograph, taken the summer of 1884 by a traveling photographer who'd passed through Cutter's Bend with his equipment and his extravagant promises about the permanence of images, which showed Naomi and Gideon and Lily on the porch of the main house. Lily was 10 in it, standing very straight, her healed arm by her side, her expression containing the specific quality of a child who has been told to hold still and is doing so through pure force of will. Naomi was beside her, and Gideon was behind them both, and the photograph was not particularly technically accomplished, but it captured something real about the three of them. The way they occupied the same space, the ease of it. James had found this photograph on the shelf in the front room and was looking at it with the serious attention he gave most things, which was his father's attention, the kind that didn't rush toward a conclusion. "Mama," he said, "why does your face look different here?" Naomi looked at the photograph. The bruise was not visible. It had been almost a year after their arrival when the photograph was taken. What James meant, she understood, was something else. Something in the way she carried herself in the photograph that was different from the way she carried herself now. He was 5, and he didn't have the vocabulary for it, but he was seeing it clearly. "I was newer here," she said. "I hadn't been here as long." He looked at the photograph, looked at her. "You look worried," he said. "I was a little worried," she said. "About what?" She thought about how much of the truth was the right amount for a 5-year-old who had grown up safe, who had no framework for what the absence of safety felt like, who deserved both the truth and the protection of not carrying weight he hadn't earned yet. "About whether this was a place I could stay," she said. "Whether it was real." He looked at the photograph again. "It was real," he said, with the confidence of someone for whom the reality of this place was so foundational as to be almost confusing as a question. "I know," she said. "I know that now." He handed her back the photograph and went to find Lily, who was in the barn doing something she'd been doing all morning that involved a great deal of focused veterinary interest in one of the spring foals. Naomi held the photograph for a moment and looked at the woman in it, the woman who was 1 year out from the stagecoach, who was still running the old warning system, who was still in the process of learning that she was allowed to want the thing she was standing inside of. She looked tired, that woman. She looked like someone carrying more than the surface showed. Naomi put the photograph back on the shelf. There is a particular thing that happens if you live long enough in a place you chose under duress and then came to love with intention, where the choosing and the loving become indistinguishable from each other. You can no longer find the seam between the necessity that brought you and the desire that kept you. It stops mattering. The place is simply yours, the way your own hands are yours. Not because you chose them, but because you have lived in them long enough that the question of choosing doesn't arise. The Cross Ranch became Naomi's hands, not metaphorically, in the specific physical sense of a person whose labor is so embedded in a place that the place carries the evidence of them everywhere. In the vegetable garden, which she'd expanded 3 times since that first frost-killed season, and which now produced enough to supply 2 neighboring families in addition to the household. In the documentation files in Emmett Crane's office, which bore her handwriting on the organizing system she'd developed, which had by 1890 helped 43 women in the territory understand something about their legal situation they hadn't known before. In the south fence, the section that had been replaced after the colt and the wire, which she had helped rebuild with her own hands on a hot August morning, with Hector directing and making no concessions to the fact that she was a woman or that her hands weren't trained for post-setting. In James, who had her eyes and Gideon's patience and a quality that belonged to neither of them, a kind of expansive, unguarded warmth, the warmth of a child who had grown up without learning to protect himself against kindness, who had received it steadily enough that it had become his default assumption about the world. She did not take credit for this. She understood it as the gift of circumstances, of having been in a place where safety was real when he arrived, of not having passed on the old warning system because by the time he came, she'd been slowly dismantling it for years. In Lily, who left for Tucson at 15 for the secondary schooling she'd planned for, and who wrote letters every week with the detailed, affectionate precision of someone who loves you and wants you to know exactly what her life looks like, and who came home for summers with new knowledge and new opinions, and the same particular look in her eye that had been there when she was 9 years old and had decided that she was allowed to want the thing she was reaching for. Gideon's hair went fully gray by 1891, which he accepted with equanimity and which Naomi told him suited him, which was true. He slowed in the particular way that strong men slow. Not all at once, not in a collapse, but in the gradual redistribution of energy that comes when a body has been doing serious work for 40-odd years and has started keeping its own counsel about the pace. He handed more of the writing to the younger ranch hands. He spent more mornings in the South Garden, which he'd always claimed was Naomi's territory, but which had become, without formal announcement, a shared project. They still sat on the porch in the evenings. They had sat on that porch through 8 winters and 8 summers, and the accumulated ordinary weight of all the seasons in between. They had talked and not talked, had said difficult things and let other things remain unsaid, had watched their children grow from specific sizes to other specific sizes, had watched the territory become less territory and more settled, had watched Cutter's Bend add a second street and a proper schoolhouse, and a doctor's office that Alderman no longer had to run from a single room in the back of his home. Mrs. Halloran had retired from the general store. Burl Whitfield had left the town council in 1887 under circumstances that Emmett Crane knew more about than he discussed. Miss Pratt was still teaching and still had strong opinions about the school board, and still won the arguments that mattered. The porch was the same. The 2 chairs, now worn to exactly the right shape by the specific weight of the 2 people who sat in them. The view of the yard and the barn and the mountains beyond that Gideon had once written about in a letter that described where he lived without trying to sell anything. "You wrote about the light," Naomi said one evening in the fall of 1891, the air gone to the particular sharp-edged clarity of October. He looked at her. "In the letter, the one from the agency, you wrote about what the light does on the mountains at the end of the day." She looked at the mountains. The light was doing exactly what it did, going gold along the upper ridges, the shadows deep in the canyons. "I'd never been anywhere that had light like this. I didn't know what you meant." "And now?" he asked. "Now I know every version of it," she said. "The winter light and the summer light and the way it looks after rain." She paused. "I know this light the way I know your face. I couldn't have imagined knowing it this well." He was quiet for a moment. "Was it worth it?" he asked. Not anxiously, not requiring a particular answer, asking because he was someone who preferred knowing the truth to assuming it. She looked at the mountains in their evening light. She thought about the woman on the stagecoach, rigid, bruised, with a child in a splint beside her, with nothing but the thin hope that the man at the other end of this journey had meant what he'd written, that the letter about the hawk's nest and the evening light had told her something true about him. She thought about all the mornings between that woman and this one, all the things that had been difficult and continued to be difficult, and the things that had shifted from difficult to simply real, the way hard-learned things become part of you rather than things you carry. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, the way he accepted true things. The light moved on the mountains, as it had every evening since before either of them arrived in this place, and would every evening long after they were done with it. The warning system, in Naomi, was quiet, not gone. She didn't think it would ever be entirely gone, didn't think people worked that way, didn't believe in the version of healing that erased everything that had been there before. But quiet. Running low and slow in the background the way old habits run when they haven't been needed in a long time. Present, but not loud. Not the thing she lived by anymore. She had built something to live by instead. That was what she would have said to the woman on the stagecoach, if she could have leaned in through the window with the red Arizona dust blowing past and said something that might actually help. Not that it gets better, which is true but too vague to be useful. Not that he's a good man, which is true, but not the point. The point was this: you are going to build something. You don't know what it looks like yet. You can't see it from here. But you're going to build it with your own hands, from the material available, in the specific conditions of the place you land. And it will not be perfect, and it will not be what you imagined, and there will be mornings when the old warning system drowns out everything else, and you won't be able to hear the difference between what was and what is. And you will get through those mornings, and there will be more mornings after them. And slowly, the way slow things happen, one thing at a time, the way a horse learns to trust, the way a bone heals if you keep it still long enough, you will know where you are. You will know that you are somewhere real. The porch light came on behind them. James, who had taken on the task of the evening lamp since he was tall enough to reach it, and the mountains went from gold to the deep purple of full dusk. And Naomi sat in her chair in her life, and the night came on, and she let it.